Well, amid those concerns that European powers are likely to be excluded from US-led peace talks with Russia, President Emmanuel Macron is set to convene EU leaders in Paris on Monday for an emergency summit on the war in Ukraine. It comes on the heels of the security conference that's been taking place in Munich, which was supposed to focus on how to end the war. Speaking in Munich, however, US Vice President J.D. Vance failed to address Ukraine. Well, for more about this, Oliver Farry from our International Affairs Desk joins me now in the studio. Oliver, what can we expect to come out of this meeting then?
Well, in the first instance, it will be to formulate a response to make sure that all European countries are in unison on Ukraine. There might be a couple of holdouts, particularly the more pro-Moscow governments such as Viktor Orban's Hungary and Robert Fico's Slovakia. But there'll also be a concerted effort to get defence spending up to Brussels' desired 3% of GDP. The European Commission intends to make it easier on member states to increase defence spending by triggering a mechanism that will allow such spending to be not included in their budget deficits. Some European countries are also only too happy to up their defence spending. Poland has already gone to 5%. And NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has effectively endorsed Donald Trump's demands by calling on European members to spend more. There will be also likely to be more aid for Ukraine considered and possibly announced. There is a possibility that all of this is brinksmanship by Donald Trump, that he might be trying to wring out more commitments out of his European partners. But there's a limited time frame, really, regardless of whether this is the case or not, Europe has to act. The attitude of the Trump administration is that Washington has been footing the bill for the war effort in Ukraine. Not entirely true, and it should call the shots. But given Trump's long-standing positive attitude towards Moscow, that's unlikely to be to Ukraine's benefit.
And is it fair to say that this is going to be a new era for European defence cooperation?
Probably. Vladimir Zelensky clearly does not want to rely upon Washington, and he's given an indication that he won't be strong-armed into a dictated peace deal with his refusal to sign a disadvantageous minerals agreement with Washington. Zelensky has called for the formation of a European army. This has been mooted for several decades now, though it's not been an easy thing to get countries on board. Public support for such an army has grown in several countries since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it's still not overwhelming. It ranges from 51% to 64% according to country. People might have previously imagined that NATO would do the job, but that can't be relied upon any longer. If there is a European army, some countries such as Ireland would flatly refuse to be part of it, but most EU members are NATO members. So a move to a European army could actually be quite swift. A lot of that cooperation is already built in. The big question is, though, that would Europeans accept involvement in a deadly war in Ukraine? Emmanuel Macron has previously said he wouldn't rule out European troops being involved in the war. Recent European involvements in conflicts such as Iraq, Afghanistan, the Sahel, and various peacekeeping operations have been fairly low casualty with regard to troops. This has not been the case in Ukraine, where tens of thousands of soldiers are dying weekly. So that would be a big test of public opinion in Europe once potentially body bags start coming home.
And what will all this mean for NATO then?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean the end for NATO, but the European members will probably be thinking of taking an operational sabbatical from it if there's no movement from Washington. Right now, it looks as if, suggesting from Pete Hegseth's comments in Munich the other day, that the US would not trigger Article 5 of NATO, which states that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. Now, in many respects, what Trump is seeking to facilitate is a recess to the post-war settlement in Europe, where the continent was divided up basically between a sort of a pro-Washington West and basically a Soviet satellite in the East. Now, that wasn't a settlement that the West desired back then, but they didn't really have much choice but to accept it. Now, this time around, Washington is happy to restore Moscow's sphere of influence, at least under Trump, and many in the former Eastern Bloc, including Poland, the Baltic states, Georgia, will fear that Vladimir Putin won't stop at Ukraine. Now, nobody is certain how long Donald Trump or his faction will remain in power in Washington, so Europe has to be ready. Many would say that they should have been making these contingencies at the start of Trump's first term in office, but you could also say that probably they should have Europe should have started making plans for this at the start of the Iraq War in 2003, when George W. Bush's administration was already showing rather dismissive attitude towards European concerns, particularly French and German opposition to the invasion. Bush was a lot more polite about it than Trump, but the signs were already there.
All right, Oliver, thank you very much for that analysis.